Hi all, it's Les Posen here, FlightWise Fear of Flying clinical psychologist. Welcome to the channel. Thank you to all those of you who've subscribed recently. It's great to see. If you're here for the first time, stick around, see if there's anything here of use to you. In the last little while, I was talking to you on this channel about reflecting on the sort of things that can be sources of upsettedness for you. Your sensations, your emotions, your behaviors, and something called cognitions. What you say to yourself, otherwise known as self-talk. And today I want to mention a little bit more about self-talk because we tend to underestimate its ability to start a process of upsetting ourselves and becoming more and more sensitive to things that don't require us to be so sensitive, so that in order to recover from that sensitivity and that upsettedness, we either get off the flight, don't take it, or use some sort of distraction mechanism, whether it be doodling, listening to music, using alcohol, or prescribed drugs. These, by the way, all have their place, but you don't rely on them forevermore. They may be used very short, very sharp, just to get you through a difficult moment. But if you're really here to overcome a lifelong or recently developed fear of flying that appears to be getting worse, those distractions are not going to help you very much. In fact, I would suggest to you that most of the time that people come to see me, usually now on Zoom, they're at their wits' end because their usual distractions are no longer sufficient. They're no longer working. Today's small, short session is about acknowledging self-talk. And as an example, I want to talk to you about your use of the term a good flight versus a bad flight. And in order to sort of deconstruct this, take this apart a little bit and to show you why it's important, the idea is going to be for you to contemplate how different people might describe what a good flight is versus a bad flight. The reason being that I want you to change your relationship to flying by changing the way you describe both the flying experience and your personal experience. So here's the example I'm going to use. Let us just imagine that we have a group of flight attendants who are taking a trip, and I'll use destinations which I'm very familiar with, from Melbourne to Brisbane. That's about a 2-hour flight. Let's also imagine that there's another group of flight attendants who are heading to the same destination to Brisbane, but this time from Adelaide. And as it turns out, of the two different flights, the two different groups of flight attendants, two of them from each of those flights will now join a third flight once they arrive, and that flight's going from Brisbane to Perth. So Melbourne to Brisbane, a bit over 2 hours. Adelaide, slightly more than 2 hours. And Brisbane to Perth, 3.5 to 4 hours, depending on the winds. You are going into wind, going in Australia from east to west, so you're going to pick up headwinds. It's much quicker coming back the other direction. So when they arrive in Brisbane on two separate flights, one from Melbourne, one from Adelaide, two from each of those flights meet up with the other two from the other flight, and they board the aircraft maybe 45 minutes before passengers are due to board. Perhaps the tech crew, that's the name we're going to give to the pilots, also referred to as flight crew, but often referred to within the industry as tech crew. The flight attendants themselves are referred to as cabin crew. Okay? Please be careful of using old-fashioned terms such as hosties or hostesses or stewardesses which had their time and kind of were aligned with a very interesting, exotic time of flying. But nowadays, crew refer to themselves as cabin crew, and they principally see themselves as safety officers. And let me suggest to you that 80% of their training that you never get to see is about safety. You only get to see 20% of their training, and that's their service to you directly. Occasionally, of course, you will see them entering safety mode at the beginning of the flight where they go through their safety briefings. During the flight, if there's a need to put on seat belts. And of course, at the end of the flight where they're told by the tech crew, cabin crew prepare the aircraft for landing, in which case they go through a specific set of conditions to make sure that the aircraft is safe to land. Let us imagine that they're all on board this plane, 2 of them from Melbourne, 2 of them from Adelaide. They all meet up together. Maybe they don't know each other. In fact, of the 4, maybe none of them know each other. But the 2 from Adelaide on board the Brisbane flight asked the 2 from Melbourne, "How was your flight up?" To which the 2 from Melbourne say, "Yeah, it was good. It was a good flight." "How was your flight?" "No, not such a good flight." And I want you to pause for a moment and contemplate, if I asked you the same question, what would constitute for you a good flight versus a bad flight? And I want to suggest to you that you're going to divide up a good flight into either is going to be the absence of something. The absence of my upsettedness, that is that I was okay, I didn't experience panicky feelings. The plane didn't experience turbulence, which can bring on panicky feelings. So you might describe what the plane did, or you might describe how you experienced the flight. Did anything spontaneous or random that was troubling to you occur? That might constitute a good or a bad flight, the difference between. But I want to suggest to you that if a flight attendant asks another flight attendant, "How was your flight?" "Yeah, it was good," that they're not referring to any of those things. They may be referring to, "We got away on time. We were able to complete the meal service. It wasn't interrupted by having to take our seats due to turbulence." That's their concern about turbulence. They didn't have to walk around the aisle making sure that everyone had their seatbelts on when the flight crew had instructed them, "Seatbelts, please." Perhaps it was a good flight because there were some really interesting people on board. Oh, we had some VIPs in 1A and 1B. We had a football team on board. It was terrific. We got some pictures and we had some photos taken. On the other hand, the football team could have been ratbags, as we say in Australia, and they had their hands full. And they had to deal with them as best they can because the airline they work for has the contract with the National Football League, as it is. What may be a bad flight? Well, the flight crew weren't that communicative. Maybe the cabin manager was a little bit prickly. He was having a bad day and was a bit on our case. Perhaps we had some difficult passengers. Not difficult because they were afraid, they were just feeling a little entitled. So how they define good and bad, I want you to see is quite different to you. And I want you to start to change the way you think about what's a good flight and what's a bad flight, because you are likely to keep on setting yourself up for not having a good relationship to flying. I want to suggest to you a good flight is one where you put into practice so many of the things that I've shown you in this channel about how to manage yourself in turbulence and in difficult conditions, or when things aren't quite going according to your plan, and to understand the sounds and the movements, and to be able to allocate a sense of normality to them, even though they may be unpleasant. So a good flight, as I encourage my patients to say when they fly with me, is I was able to put into practice all that I've been learning. At the end of the flight, it wasn't that I experienced relief. That wasn't the target behavior. The target behavior was practicing all that I've learned and having a sense of empowerment that the more I keep practicing this, the better I'm going to get at this. And it will require practice. And you dispense with this idea that you can divide up flights into good and bad, because that's going to set you up for what I call superstitious behavior. What's the weather like? Oh, it's so cloudy, it's going to be such a bad flight. No! The flight may be bumpy. The flight might be delayed. It may have to do perhaps even a missed approach if it's foggy going into your location. But it's perfectly normal, and it's not unsafe. So be careful of setting yourself up using your own language. Or if you're going down the jetway behind me, call it a jetway or an aero bridge. But once you start to refer to it as I go down the tunnel and then I'm trapped on the plane, that language will set off that threat response mechanism. That radar is on the lookout for the language that you use, and you will set yourself up at the very beginning of the flight for it to be a challenge. Start to use the language that commercial aviation uses. Get into the lingo. Get familiar with it. Don't be afraid of it. Re-establish a good relationship with aviation rather than it's the enemy. So be careful of setting yourself up using your own language for having a bad flight, which means I wasn't able to cope with this, and therefore that increases the chances that I will avoid the next flights or have to hunker down with my distractions, but also knowing that they're getting less and less useful to me. So I hope this use of language is really important to you. It should become important. Start to change the way you think about the language that you use to describe what the aeroplane uses or does, and how you experience these flights. Start to change your language. For those of you who are claustrophobic, my one little piece of advice is start to practice for that moment when the door closes and the cabin manager announces, the forward door has now closed. This is flight XYZ. We're off to Brisbane. And you go, oh God, here we go. Be careful. At home, please practice. Every time you walk through a doorway or at work, close the door behind you and say to yourself, doors closed, stay composed. Let that be your new mantra. For those of you in turbulence, keep practicing. When you're bumping around in a car or in a bus or on a train, turbulence might be uncomfortable. I don't have to like it, but it's not unsafe. I know what to do. I hope these hints are helpful. Please write down in the comments some of the language you've been using, and let's see if we can help you start to challenge and change some of that language. It's really important because that threat system in your brain, called the limbic system, has got its radar going, and your use of language, especially catastrophic language, can often be the starting point for it to go into high vigilance mode, which will only drive up your sensations into a very uncomfortable situation, to which the only way out is to leave, hunker down, or not do this at all. I hope this has been helpful. More to come over the next few weeks of December. Take care. Bye for now.